We are live. Baruch Hashem. Welcome, everybody, to our Mashiach Shir at our new time and day, Monday night at 8 p.m., where we will collectively bring the redemption. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה b'dvaro. I dedicate tonight's learning to the full and final redemption. Mashiach now, I think by anyone's account, if you look at the world, more and more Mashiach is needed desperately, and more you see Hashem breaking our reliance on anything. We can not rely on our governments, not on our politicians, not on anything. In fact, the only one we could put our trust in is the one above. And with that, let's move on. Let's keep on rocking in the free world while they haven't totally curtailed freedom of speech. Okay, this is a very, very powerful sikha we're learning tonight. As is known, all these teachings from the series of Nun Aleph Nun Beis, the teachings of the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach that are connected to redemption, are very, very powerful teachings. And then there are some that stand out more than others, and this in particular is one of those. But I don't want to keep blabbing. Let's let the Rebbe do the talking. But we will see how this unfolds. It's quite mesmerizing. Okay. Tavis Parshas Mishpatim. This is originally given on Zach Shvat, the 20th of Shvat, and also on Rosh Chodesh Adar, Aleph. Tafshin Nun Beis, 29 years ago. Aleph. It is known that all the events that unfold in the world are hashgacha pratis. In other words, there's no coincidences. Despite what chaos it looks like is going on in the world, everything is unfolding exactly according to the divine plan and into God's will. And therefore, in all the events that take place and that transpire, there is a specific teaching related to our service of our Creator. How much more so is this applicable to the general and main connection with the great countries, we should say, and the most important countries that the Yidden are residing in the time of the Gullus, and that the influence and conduct of this country specifically spreads out throughout the entire world. And this includes the teaching of, in general and mainly, our service of us and our Creator. And the Rebbe is talking about America. The Rebbe, on numerous occasions, has referred to America as a Malchus Sheba Chesed, a Aleichem Shalom, a nation or a kingdom of kindness. And it's known that in the time of the diaspora, the main concentration of Jews is in America, which is in fact why the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, chose to establish Lubavitch headquarters in America. And we'll learn more about that as we continue. And how much more so in these particular days we are in. The Kol HaRosh, first of all, we are standing here as it's connected to Erev Shabbos. Shabo Tasayfai Vatiknasai Yehidav Yachdav. Rashi Hamedinas Gadoides Vachashavis Ba'id. And on Erev Shabbos, in this year, Tafshin Beis, 1992, all the heads of the most important countries in the world gathered at the UN for a very important meeting. Nasi Shtei Ha'atzmois. Including the heads the Nasias, the presidents and leaders of the respective countries. It is mind-boggling stuff. I would venture to say that most people are probably not aware or have any recollection that this happened, but it did, and it's mind-boggling that there was a special meeting at the UN with all the heads of all the nations of the world, the foremost countries in the world, to discuss a new relationship and a new term of existence that will unfold amongst the relationship between the nations of the world. Bitul Mitzav Shel Melchamos Ben Medinas Ha'elam, to nullify the weapons of war. It's hard to imagine, but this actually took place in the UN on Erev Shabbos on Rosh Chodesh Adar 29 years ago, that the nations of the world and all the leaders of the nations of the world gathered at the UN building in New York to discuss destroying and no longer creating weapons of war, and a plan to destroy and nullify weapons of war, to remove whatever pending weapons they had, and to move forward in a new period of unity and peace. It's mind-blowing that this took place and that there's no discussions about it now, but that's exactly what happened. Shi'etoif po'ola ve'azra hadidis ben medinas ha'edam l'toivos ha'anoshois kulon, and to cooperate and to establish a new partnership that they will mutually help one another and bring goodness and peace to the world. Mind-boggling. And prior to the opening speech of the leader of this country to the other nations of the world, came I don't know what the word I'm looking for, the advancement to bring forth new resolutions and new activities to nullify weapons of war, to literally remove weapons of war and cease from creating weapons of war. And instead to focus on adding on in economic matters amongst countries, that there should be no more war. Instead, they should focus on how they can help one another. And this was approved through the House of Congress. Excuse me. And to bring forth amongst the nations of the world and the countries new resolutions according to the ways of the Torah. Mind-boggling. So we have to comprehend and learn out the teachings from this event, and specifically as they're connected to the time and place. Got to listen carefully to this class tonight, because it's going to blow your mind. And listen to this. And the Rebbe says, and not only was it a major event that unfolded, but the time and place that it unfolded is of significant importance. Including the connection to the time of reading the Torah, which is the parsha of the week, Mishpatim. Mishpatim is all about laws, and all about laws that make logical sense. Obviously, we keep all the laws in the Torah because it's God's will. We'll talk more about that. And we don't do it because they make sense. Nevertheless, Mishpatim are specifically the halachas, the laws in the Torah that are connected to things that are understandable with the human mind. And that's when this tremendous, unprecedented event took place in the UN 29 years ago. Base. And more than that, not just the time of the parsha of the week, but the events that led up to it, which we will learn about with God's help. Base. Who be'enim klali be'ikor avodas shel bnei Yisrael lahaveh lemos haMashiach. First, we have to learn out that the main teachings and announcements and the main service right now of the Jewish people is to bring the days of Mashiach. The Rebbe has said numerous times, and in fact, this entire sichas are wrapped around this one concept, that the entire culmination of all of our work as Jewish people over the 3,000 years since we've got the Torah, and all of mankind since creation 5,781 years ago, is culminating and bringing up to this exact moment in time. The grand finale of all creation is literally unfolding right in front of us. And therefore, our avodas Hashem, our work and our connection to God, which is our main work while we're here in this world, is specifically related, as the Rebbe relates to us numerous times, especially recently, to bring about the days of Mashiach. That is the focus. That should be our foremost focus of every one of us all the time. Yeah. How you doing? And not only that, the acknowledgement and recognition of the true and complete redemption through our righteous Mashiach, the Mashiach that is anointed according to the Torah, according to the halachas of the Torah, not the many false messiahs that unfortunately a lot of other religions have wrongfully been led to believe in. But there is clear laws according to the Jewish law. The Rambam elucidates all the qualifications to bring Mashiach. I'm not reading inside, but by the way, one of the requirements is that when Mashiach reveals himself, one of his jobs is that there will be peace in the world. So clearly Mashiach could not have come previously because the world is not in a state of peace at this point in time. There is still wars going on, and there's still, unfortunately, a lot of violence going on in the world. Once Mashiach does reveal himself in a permanent way, all that will cease. But that's just one point. And if you look in the Rambam, in the Sefer Malachim, in the Book of Kings, at the end are all the laws that are laid out according to the Torah as to the qualifications to be Mashiach. And it's acknowledgement and relevant not only to the Jewish people, but to the nations of the world, the Rebbe says. And what is one of the things, one of the jobs of Mashiach that the prophet Yeshayahu says, Isaiah, as they say in the English vernacular, is that when Mashiach comes, v'chasasoi haravoisam la'oisim v'chani soisihem l'mizmarois lo yisha goy el goy charav v'lo yiramdu oy machama. That the nations of the world will turn their weapons into plowshares, literally their weapons of war into farming tools and farming shears, literally. And nation will no longer lift up to fight war against another nation, and the entire there will be no more wars. Basically, there will be no more unrest. There will be no more wars. And we will reach a culmination of a state of peace. That is one of the prophecies from Yeshayahu of what will happen when Mashiach comes. Now, Haisif, in addition to this, that this will take place through the activities of Mashiach himself. In other words, the actions of Mashiach himself will help bring about this total state of peace. If I'm not mistaken, our most recent term of presidency from President Trump over the last 4 years is the first presidential term, and I'm not a history buff, but in quite some time where there has actually not been any new wars that have taken place. No major wars have taken place in the last 4 years. The Amim Rabim, and this is brought down at the beginning of the Pasuk. And one of the tasks of Mashiach is he will admonish the nations of the world, and he will admonish them for their sins and help them to no longer lead a crooked path, but to go into the into the straight path of no more wars, and there will be no more wars. And therefore, ba'achris hayimim nachon yeh har bayit Hashem goyim and haru elav kol hagoyim v'halocha amim rabim v'amru lacha la'ala al har Hashem al beit Eloki Yaakov v'yirenu v'drachav v'chav and this is one of the other jobs of Mashiach, that he will ascend to Har Tzion, and he will judge the nations of the world, and he will encourage them to go in the ways of Masri, Shalom Aleichem, welcome. And Mashiach will encourage the nations of the world to go in the way of God, to go in God's ways. And that he will spread forth from Tzion, and the Torah and the Word of God throughout Yerushalayim. And this is one of the tasks of Melech HaMashiach. He will judge the nations of the world, specifically for how they treated the Jewish people throughout the times of the exile. And I don't know if there's any nations or religions at this point in time that do not have a tremendous amount of Jewish blood on their hands, and they should be doing tshuva real quickly, because the time of judgment is right around the corner. And that is one of the jobs of Melech HaMashiach. He will judge the nations of the world, and he will bring peace to the world, and he will teach the word of Hashem throughout the world. Okay, and he will announce amongst the heads of the world, amongst the heads of the nations, and that there will be a nullification of weapons of war. Sorry, Yusuf calling me BRB. Okay, and as we said previously, according to the prophet Yeshayahu, there will be no more wars, and nations of the world will no longer lift up sword against one another, and they will turn their swords into plowshares, and the weapons of war will be literally nullified and used instead for farming tools. Eretz mana yitzay lechem, harizeh siman berur al etchilas kiyoymen shel Yehud. Zeh berur mitzvah shlem arim et shir tzikinu. And this is one of the signs of the nations of the world. The Rebbe says no longer promoting war and instead looking for true peace. Of the beginning of the fulfillment of the prophecy of the true and complete redemption through Mashiach, our righteous Redeemer. Yes, that'll be ours. So let's explain this even further. Since we have already reached the culmination, the Rebbe says, the highest point of the point right before the full and final redemption, that we are literally holding at the point of Hinizeh Melech HaMashiach Bo, that literally Mashiach is literally at the threshold. And therefore the Rebbe says we can already see the beginning of the activities of Melech HaMashiach on the nations of the world. We already see the effect that Melech HaMashiach is having on the world. And that his influence amongst the nations of the world, to influence them to no longer start wars, instead to, as we said, turn their swords into plowshares, like the prophet Yeshayahu says. In fact, that the Rebbe, as far as I know, there's been no previous rabbis, no previous world leaders in history that have taken it upon themselves to start a campaign amongst educating the nations of the world, amongst educating them as that they have an obligation in this world, which is the 7 laws of Noah, the 7 basic building blocks for a just and moral society, that the Rebbe has been pushing for years across the world. Never before has that been done. This is one of the signs as well of Mashiach's work in the world. And therefore we see already that through the announcements and the beginning of this process of turning their swords into plowshares. And that, of course, is what the Rebbe is referring to, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, exactly what happened at this monumental meeting of the UN that took place 29 years ago. וזהו הטעם שחקלת הכריזה זה היסר בזמן זה דווקא בגלל שייכות ישראל המיוחדת לגאולה מצווה שלמה משיח tzidkenu בפועל ממש. And therefore, the Rebbe says, this announcement that took place at the UN 29 years ago when the heads of all the countries gathered to specifically discuss the prophecy of Isaiah of turning their swords into plowshares and fulfilling the prophecy of the redemption. The Rebbe said it is directly and specifically connected to the activities of Melech HaMashiach in the world to bring about the full and final redemption in actuality. And again, we're going to get into this a little bit more, but the Rebbe has said clearly that the reason the nations of the world gathered at the UN building 29 years ago to declare peace, to fulfill the prophecy of Yeshayahu, and to discuss how it's time to stop war and work on true peace and to get rid of our weapons of war is specifically connected to the activities that Melech HaMashiach himself was carrying forth in the world at that time. Gimel. In addition to this, בתחילת פועל הסוי של משיח tzidkenu מורגשת גם בפרטי האמורה המקויים בזמן שבהם הייתה הקלטת וכריזת ראשי המדינה של המאמור מצב וכסף הרבויסם לעשים. And therefore we're going to see specifically the connection to that time and place that brought forth the heads of the world's top countries to discuss no longer producing weapons of war and to focus instead on peace. The Rebbe said, first of all, we have to take a look at the specific place that this meeting took place. This meeting of the heads of the nations of the world took place in America and specifically in New York. Hamedina v'ha'irahu shenimtza beit Rabbeinu shebabavel. This is mind-boggling stuff right here. It really is. The Rebbe said, and why did the meeting take place in New York? Because New York is the location of Beit Rabbeinu shebabavel, the house of the leader of the generation, which is in the time of Bavel, in the time of the exile, which is Beit Chayinu, the house of our life, Beit HaKnesset or Beit HaMidrash, the place of our learning and the place of our davening, Beit HaTorah Tefillah U'Mugmor Chasidim, the synagogue of our Torah learning and our prayers and our good deeds, the Kaveh Kadosh V'Moed V'Chami Admor Nasi Dorenu, the home and the synagogue of the leader of the generation, the Rebbe referring to his father-in-law as well as himself. Because this is specifically the place where the Torah learning from the leader of the generation is spread forth to the entire world. This is the destination, that the teachings of Torah from the leader of the generation are spreading out to the furthest corners of the world up until the time of our righteous Redeemer Mashiach. And then we will have the complete fulfillment of the prophecy of they will no longer make weapons of war and they will turn their swords into plowshares. This is mind-boggling stuff. We're going to continue talking about this. But just to pause and realize this, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because the Rebbe is probably going to say it right now. Okay, I'm going to say it anyways, because even if the Rebbe is going to say it again, I think it's worth discussing for 1 second. The Rebbe has flat out said, and he's going to say it later on in the Sikha again, but I'm going to cut to it because I'm too excited to hold myself back. Think about this for a second. The President of the United States of America, which by pretty much anyone's account is the foremost nation, the superpower of the world, had to leave Washington, D.C. to travel to New York to meet with the other heads of the countries. And of course, it begs the question, why isn't the UN in Washington, D.C.? Washington, D.C. is where the capital is. That's where the White House is. That's where the center of America is. And that's where the center of world activities is focused. So why is the UN in New York? The Rebbe clearly says the UN is in New York because that's where 770 is. Because 770 is the house, it's the main shul of the leader of the generation. And therefore, 770 is the focal point of spreading out Torah to the entire world. And therefore, the United Nations is specifically in New York because for no other reason that 770 is in New York. It's mind-boggling. That's why the UN is in New York. In case you ever wondered why the UN is not in Washington, D.C., well, the Rebbe just told us. Because 770 is in New York. And despite what goes on in the UN behind closed doors, which we know they're not exactly friendly to our people and to our country, talking about Israel, plastered right on the front of the UN building, says in bold letters, and they will turn their swords into plowshares. Quoted by the prophet Isaiah, Yeshua. All a result of the fact that this is where 770 is. The Indian is to go a little bit deeper, that the leader of the generation specifically came to America when the Frierdiker Rebbe located the Lubavitch to America, 770 particularly. Specifically to this place and this country and this city. Specifically to rectify and purify the lower half of the world, the furthest down, the most physical aspect of the world. Everyone asks, why is the Rebbe not in Israel? Because Israel doesn't need the work of rectification. The government of Israel sure does, but that's a different story. But this is the main place of the diaspora. This is the main focal point for the world, and this is where the main work had to be, and that's why the Rebbe specifically chose to come to America. Furthermore, continuation after the revealing of the giving of the Torah, and how much more so in this specific place, where the teachings of Chassidus, specifically the inner aspect of the Torah, have been spread forth to the furthest corners of the globe. Where representatives of the leader of the generation have been sent out to the furthest corners of the world. That's where the Chabad Shluchim are sent out. That's where the Lubavitch headquarters is. And that's why over 6,000, maybe 7,000 shluchim across the world have been sent out specifically from 770 Eastern Parkway. In order to spread forth godliness and purify the world. To spread out the Torah to the Yidden across the world. And not only spreading out Torah to the Jewish people throughout the world, but also spreading out the Torah of the 7 laws of Noach that must be fulfilled, the 7 specific laws that must be filled by all the nations of the world as well. And how much more so has this activity been emphasized in recent years? In fact, it was pretty much usher. I think any Rav would have told the Jewish people up until this point in time, we would have not been allowed to spread out the 7 laws of Noach throughout the world, specifically because there was such hostility between the nations of the world against the Jewish people. And now in these days that has been diminished, and therefore not only are we allowed, but the Rebbe says we're obligated. We must be a light unto the nations, and we must spread the Torah of the 7 laws of Noach and the specific job of the nations, where we're responsible for spreading to them what their mission is to bring redemption. And these activities specifically will bring closer the full and final redemption through Mashiach. And then the speech, the tongue of the nations of the world will be transformed and purified, and all of them will serve one God. No more idolatry, no more false religions. Everyone will realize that it's all about Hashem, one God. And specifically in this most recent period of time, all the God v'hachriza milchama v'chafutza Torah v'yochudas v'aron milchama v'amuna b'vura v'olam hamenhigay ava b'chein namshachas gam shem ha'pulat shluchim nasi dorei chafutza Torah v'yochudas v'chatzin v'siris nefesh mamash. And we see through the activities of the shluchim, and the Rebbe in his humility never refers to himself. I don't think he's ever referred to himself. He always refers to himself as a continuation of the previous Rebbe, of his Rebbe. And he said all the shluchim of the previous Rebbe, including himself, have gone out to the furthest corners of the world in complete self-sacrifice to fulfill this mission of bringing the redemption closer. And specifically in this most recent term, when all the decrees of our host nations have been removed, and we're living in America, which allows the Jewish people to openly and comfortably practice in their religion, and this has resulted in a tremendous increase in the spreading out of the teachings of Torah and mitzvahs throughout the furthest corner of the world. And this was not permissible in previous governments, previous countries. And the Rebbe says not only that, now we're in such a time and place that the world leaders and governments have openly acknowledged their belief and faith in the creator of the world. The Rebbe is referring also to the times in Russia. Russia at one point in time completely denied the existence of God. To even speak about God was unheard of. Not only unheard of, it was a violation. It was treason, high treason against Mother Russia. It was a crime and punishable by death. And not only that, now in Russia is filled with shluchim of the Rebbe and openly discussing Hashem. We see how much things have transformed in our times. בהמשך לזה, התקיימה בערב שבת זו, שפגישה בין המנהיג החדש של מדינה ההיא למנהיג של מדינה זה, מספר של סם של אוי כמה מנהגים מדינס הגדולת בעולם, שבו נתקבלס הפלטס והכריזה, שתכף וכססות, אבל סתם לדמי, and the Rebbe says we find ourselves. The Rebbe gave the Sikha on Shabbos, but he said that Erev Shabbos, right before the Rebbe gave the Sikha, was a gathering, a meeting of all the heads of the nations. And specifically, he's pointing to the head of Russia and the heads of America, the president of the respective countries, where they met together at the UN in New York, in the Rebbe's hometown, to discuss destroying all the weapons of war and turning their swords into plowshares. I'm willing to bet most people have no idea that this took place, including me. The first time I learned the Sikha, I was blown away to learn that this actually happened. ויש לומר שבקיומה של פגישה הקלטה והחדש הזה בעיר של נשיא דורנו כבקודש ומרי האדמו"ר, and we see specifically how this good resolution announcement took place specifically in the hometown in the city of the leader of the generation, Ruma שכל זה בוי כתוצאה מהפרלסי דחפוצת התורה הייחודס, and we see this specifically as a result, the Rebbe says, of the activities of spreading out the wellspring to the furthest corner of the world, Tzedek v'yashar, in a righteous and straight way, v'kol ha'olam, throughout the whole world, shenaseh v'nasim, aydi nasi d'reinu, Mashiach shebador, as a direct result of the activities, specifically through the leader of our generation, who is automatically, as the Rebbe has said many times, the Mashiach of the generation, as we have set forth numerous times in these classes. The leader of the generation, the Rebbe of the generation. Rebbe is an acronym for Rosh Bnei Yisrael. That's why Moshe was called Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our Rebbe. Rebbe is the acronym for the head of the Jewish people. And in every generation, the Rebbe, or the head of the Jewish people, is the leader of the generation. And he's also the Mashiach of the generation. And if Hashem says it is time for the generation to be redeemed, just like he did with Moshe at the time of going out of Egypt, that in fact that the Mashiach of the generation becomes the actual Mashiach. And as we learned a few weeks ago, prior to Yud Shvat, marking the 70th anniversary of the Rebbe taking over as the leader of the generation, as the Mashiach of the generation, and as the Mashiach, that our generation has merited. The Rebbe said, we are finally the generation of redemption. Hashem has given the green light. And therefore, of course, the Rebbe as the leader of the generation and the Mashiach of the generation automatically becomes Mashiach and the Redeemer, as the Rebbe set forth in Basi Lagani 70 years ago. And through the complete service in these days and times, that we already see and can recognize the beginning of the activities of Melech HaMashiach in the world. Shvat ben hagoyim v'hachiach na'amim rabim v'kasa hadaroisa d'amisim. Specifically, to influence the nations of the world to turn their swords into plowshares. The Rebbe is going to continue on with this, but it's really mind-boggling. The Rebbe flat out says that the UN met in New York because that's where 770 is. And not only that, he says it, continue to say it. We're going to learn throughout the Sikha. It wasn't that all of a sudden the leaders of the let's face it, war is very profitable. Now's not the time to go into the fact that every single war in the history of this world was staged and was organized beforehand. These aren't impromptu things that just happen. There's massive amounts of money to be made through war. And every one of these wars has been calculated. And the fact that the nations of the world said all of a sudden, we don't want war anymore, we want peace, isn't because they woke up one day and said, you know what, we're ready to be good boys. No. The Rebbe said it's because they started crapping bricks, because Melech HaMashiach was spreading out, sending Hasidim and Shluchim to the furthest corners of the world. The stir for the redemption was so powerful. The whole world was shaking and waiting for the Rebbe to say, Mashiach is, that's it, we're going to the Geula. They got nervous. They saw the teacher literally walking back into the classroom, and all of a sudden, all the kids in the class were like, oh, teacher's back. Okay, yeah, what do we have to do? Let's start behaving. And that's exactly what happened. And that's what the Rebbe is telling us in the Sikha. Specifically through the work of Melech HaMashiach, specifically through spreading out Hasidus and spreading out the teachings of Chabad Hasidus to the furthest corners of the world with thousands and thousands of shluchim of the Rebbe. The nations of the world realize that their time is up, that it's time for them to start doing everything they can to start following Hashem's guidelines. And that's why all of a sudden they said, guys, the heat's on. Let's get together. It's time to make peace. Again, not because they decided they wanted to be righteous overnight, because they felt the heat. They felt what was happening. They felt Mashiach transpiring just like the rest of the world did. And therefore, call it what you want. I call it damage control. But let's continue. V'gam hazman shebo ira mo'ora zu uzman musogal b'shaychos nugula mitzad kama imni. And the Rebbe says, And the fact that this took place at this date and this time, this meeting in this place of the UN to declare peace, has many matters of hashgacha pratis connected to it. We're now going to talk about three of them. Aleph. Excuse me. I'm going to have to speed up because it's a long sikha and I'm taking a lot of time, but it's a lot of good stuff here. Mitzad Yemei HaShavua, Erev Shabbos. Erev HaChana, the Yom Shechol Shabbos Murachal Hayodamim. Shebo, Meshavet is a Zikin, Min HaOyel. Yisirim Zebo, Musifim, Mechol, Al HaKodesh. Meshal Hazara, Hazara, Terez, Zamar. Nasa Kavan, Erev Shabbos, Maram Mitzad, Yom Shechol Shabbos, and Mashiach. Okay, the Rebbe says, first of all, this meeting took place on Erev Shabbos. And we know that Shabbos is connected to Mashiach, because when Shabbos comes, we'll have eternal peace. In fact, the Yemot HaMashiach is called Shabbos, because after the 6 days of working in the thousands of years we've been here in this world, we've reached Shabbat, we reached the day of rest. And therefore, specifically, the meeting took place on Erev Shabbos. Base. Mitzad Yemei Chodesh, Yom Chavav Chodesh, Kamatri D'Shem Havai. Second, connected specifically to the day of the week. It took place on the 26th day of the month of Shvat, and 26 is Gematria of Havaya, God's name, the tetragrammaton, as they call it in the vernacular of the English language. Gimel, V'oi v'gam ze'ikr. It's also connected specifically to the leader of the generation. It's the Shabbos, which was the final Shabbos of the month of Shvat. We know that Shvat is the 11th month of the year. And the 11th and the 10th day of Shvat was the day of the Hilula, the elevation of the soul of the previous Rebbe. And not only that, the Rebbe says, and the 11th, number 11 is indicative of the continuation of his leadership. We know that the Rebbe took over as Rebbe on the 11th of Shvat, we've said many times already. The 11th, Shvat is the 11th month when you're counting from the sun. The Rebbe took over in the 11th year, 5711, and on the 11th day, the 11th of Shvat. And the Rebbe's birthday is the 11th of Nisan, and the Rebbe says numerous times in the Sichas that the number 11 is directly connected to redemption. It's referring to God as one above all the 10 things and all the 10 sefirot in the world, showing God's unity amongst everything. Throughout the continuation, the Rebbe says of 42 years of the Frierdiker Rebbe's leadership into the Rebbe's leadership, which is indicative of the 42 journeys in the desert. All these are signs as to why and this meeting took place in the UN on that day of the week, on that day of the month, and that specific time. Daled. And it's also a connection to the Parsha of the week. Parsha Mishpatim, which we're in now. And these are the laws that I'm giving forth before you. And Rashi explains, I'm going to, as I said, it's a long sequel, so I'm going to start not translating every word, but reading through and then giving it over to conserve some time. So just to start, that we know that the mishpatim are laws that are specifically connected to laws amongst one another, and laws that make specific sense. You know, like if you told your average person you're not allowed to just go up and kill someone, most people of somewhat normal intelligence would say that, well, that makes sense. You're not allowed to just randomly break into stores and steal things, regardless of what your meaning or your purpose of that is. Most Normal people would say, yeah, that makes sense. You don't take something that doesn't belong to you. So there's basic laws that are given, and Mishpatim is all about these laws that are given from Hashem on Har Sinai, and that's why we have to keep them. But nevertheless, there are things that are specifically relatable that make sense in our brain. Rebbe says, and these specific laws, even if the Torah didn't give them to us, you were able to derive from your brain that these things make sense. They're basic laws for morality amongst how we should behave to one another. And again, common sense is not so common these days. הפרשה ואילו משפטים אף אלו מסיני שגם המשפטים שהיכולים מבין כל האדם צריכים לקיים מפני ציווה הקדוש ברוך הוא. And nevertheless, even though these are laws that make sense in our brain, that's not the reason that God gave them to us. The reason that we're fulfilling them is specifically because, God commanded them to us. It's a very important point we have to recognize. We don't keep the Torah, we don't keep mitzvahs, and the 7 laws that are specific to the nations of the world are not to be kept because they make logical sense. If they make logical sense to you, well, wonderful, that's a bonus. But that's not the point. The point of these laws is specifically because God commanded us. And that is a little bit about what we spoke about in last week's Sikha, is that we must start with a basic premise that the entire Torah comes from God. And therefore, we keep the Torah and we fulfill the Torah because God said so. God creates us. He created us, and he continues to create us, and he continues to create the world. And therefore, he continues to create the world in a way that he wants the world to exist and that his rules of the world, right? You go into someone's house or their place of work, you have to abide by their rules. You go into a professional sports game, or you go into a library or a museum, you can't just start breaking things. You have to abide by the rules of the place you're in. That makes sense to most people. But when you tell them that God has rules, all of a sudden everyone comes up with all these excuses why they shouldn't listen. So that's the first basic premise, is that these laws come from Hashem, and therefore we must fulfill them even if they make logical sense. Hey, let's get a little deeper. ואלו המשפטים אף אלו מסיני, יש לומר פירוש שגם הסיבה לחיוב ושכל משפטים, הוא סיני. ולולא ניסן מסיני לא היה שכל האדם מחייבים. והסבר בזה שחיוב השכל הוא כתוצאה מזה שבציוויים אלו נתלבש לרצונו של הקדוש ברוך הוא. That even though, again, they may seem to make sense from us, that is only because Hashem enclothed his will in such a way that it should make sense. In other words, we have a natural intuitive, most normal people have a natural intuitive sense that you can't go and steal something from another person. You just can't do it. It doesn't make, it's not right. You just don't go into someone's house or their place of work and just take their stuff for whatever reason you may have. You just don't kill other people. You don't rape women. These are things that most people would say make sense. But why do they make sense? They make sense because God created our brain that they should make sense. In other words, even the fact that they make sense is from God. First of all, we keep them because God commanded us to do so. But second of all, we do it because, that's not why we do it, but we reason that, that makes sense, that makes sense. But the Rebbe is saying now that the only reason that makes sense is because God enclosed his will in our brains that it should make sense. He didn't have to hardwire us that way. He didn't have to program us that way that it makes sense. Maybe it didn't make sense. Maybe he could have made hardwired us to the point that we thought it's okay to just go around murdering and raping and stealing. But he didn't. And again, that's a product of God. And this is based on the will of God that he implanted into our brains. שזהו תכן החידוש למען תורה, שבטל הגזרה וההפסק, And this is one of the things that took place in the giving of the Torah, is that God nullified the separation between the upper worlds and the lower worlds, so that God's wisdom can be enclosed in our brains down here below. The Indians that strictly used Gan Etzel and Mother Idol, but no the kilometers of the Medah. Sha'af the Hadas Naita the Hen, Strick Shebekabo Isim and Nasa Isim Nation Shetzava, the Henakor Bohabatar. Alo im Asam Libre Hakara Hadas. Eno Mahsid or Mother Idol below Mahachami. The Rebbe says the same thing with the 7 laws of Noach. In fact, the Rambam brings down halachically that there is a place for the nations of the world in the world to come, as long as they, and this is a basic halacha, that the land of Israel is open for foreigners to dwell in, meaning non-Jews. The land of Israel was created by God and is created by God as a eternal home for the Jewish people, and God allows, unlike many other nations that do not allow the Jewish people in their countries, God allows the Jewish people to share the land of Israel with others, provided that they keep the 7 laws of Noah. And there will be a place for the nations of the world in the days of Mashiach, provided that they keep the 7 laws of Noah. But the Rambam adds a qualification. It's not enough that they keep them because it makes logical sense. Baruch Hashem, I've given out thousands and thousands of cards of 7 laws of Noach wherever I go. Just came back from Colorado, skiing with my family. I gave them to pretty much everyone I saw, every opportunity to explain to the goyim. There weren't much Jews around in our ski resorts, so we got to live with a lot of goyim and explain to them these are God's 7 laws for a just universal world, and by keeping them, it will bring you blessings. And they're specifically have to be kept, not because they make logical sense, but they do, for the most part, to most people. Nevertheless, you do them. Some laws of health for rocks or cars. Nevertheless, you do them specifically because it is God's will. In other words, when Mashiach comes, all the nations of the world will bow down and acknowledge that the God of the Jewish people is the true God and the only God, and there's only one God. There's no 3, there's no trifectas here, there's no dividing, it's one God. And we are here to fulfill the will of the one God. And that is the key in fulfilling all the Torah for the Jewish people and for the non-Jews. And this will reach its ultimate culmination in the days of Mashiach. And we will no longer need to teach the nations of the world and no longer need to teach each other, because the entire world will know God, and the entire occupation of the world will only be to know God. And the entire world will be filled with the knowledge of God. And the knowledge of God will deeply penetrate into the brains of all humanity. It will be just as right now, no one can convince anyone that this is not a cup of water, right? You see there's a cup of water. It will be so deeply ingrained in our being, the existence of God, that nobody will ever question God again. It'll be that obvious. And it's starting to happen now. And we see this hinted also in the end of the Parsha. Yirav as a Lakei Yisrael Tachas Regulai Kamasa Levanoit Haspir Vayachazoi as Elohim Vichol Mishtoi Sharias Elokus Damshachas Hadoras Besech Adam Achtis Achtos Amukma Amazoin Vechila Bishtia Shinamar Gam Vesar Vesarai Adir Lemon Penimis Torah Every Shabbat Messiah First Chassidus Chabal, talking about when we eat and when we drink and we're blessing God, and we say Baruch HaMazoin, and that we see specifically through learning the innermost dimension of the Torah, the Penimis of the Torah, which is the Chassidus of the Torah, in a way that we grasp and understand it. And the Rebbe says specifically the Torah Chassidus of Chabad, and specifically through teaching these laws to the nations of the world. This helps start to penetrate this godly energy and this godly knowledge into the depths of our brain. As things go deeper into our brain and our soul, they enter deeper into the world. In fact, the Rebbe says in one of these sichas that the only reason we're still in the exile is because the Torah is still in the exile. In other words, the more Chassidus we learn and the deeper and deeper we delve into the Torah, the more godly light, kind of like digging into the ground, spreads forth. Vav. This and according to what we said above, as it specifically connected to the heads of the nations of the world who gathered together in the city of the Frierdiker Rebbe, in the city of the leader of the generation, specifically on Erev Shabbos, specifically in Parshas Mishpatim, in order to discuss turning swords into plowshares. And this we can understand. The Rebbe says, this is here comes some boom, boom, pigazim, bombs. This could be understood, the Rebbe said, the fact that we need to start turning our swords into plowshares. Not only because that it's written in prophecy from the prophet Yeshayahu, but because God started opening up the brains of the leaders of the world, that this makes sense. It makes sense. Why keep having war? It makes sense to start thinking about peace. In other words, there's a lot of things going on right here. All the reasons we brought forth as to why this took place at this point in time was from above, but also God started opening up the brain from below. Right? We spoke about last week's sikha how we have to have above and below, this very high godly energy above the world, and the world has to contain it. So God's bringing all this energy down from above, the Rebbe spreading out, bringing redemption, spreading out throughout the furthest corners of the world. The nations of the world are starting to freak out, and at the same time, God is opening up the brains of the heads of the nations. And well, you know what? Maybe this does make sense. So we're having both dualities happening, right? From above and below. And it starts making sense to the nations and their heads that they should be obligated to fulfill their jobs and their missions in the world in a way of tzedek v'yashar, in righteousness and peace, in a straight way. Specifically through destroying their weapons of war. Rahmani litzlan. Because previously, that was not the case. May Hashem protect us. Previously, they took great joy in destruction. It was a pastime for them, right? You know, like some people like to go fishing, some people like to bowl. They used to in the world say, "Hey, let's go to war." They enjoyed it. It was a great time for them. Not like the smell of napalm in the morning. There's the Rebbe says, nevertheless, we see, despite the fact that it would make logical sense that you shouldn't go to war, throughout our history, we see an ongoing, continuous cycle of wars and destruction, which seems to be the complete opposite of what any normal thinking person would tell you is the right thing to do. But the Rebbe says, we see that truly we have entered a new term, a new period, to end and reach a completion of wars in the world. Dichilas tekufa chadasha shel kiyum ha'olam al pi tzedek v'yasher shalom v'achdus, and to begin a new period of peace and righteousness and doing the right thing amongst the nations of the world. Could mudgash v'yosur b'hatlatais v'charizas. Excuse me. Manhige umot ha'olam be'eretz Shabbos, and we see that this was emphasized specifically on that Erev Shabbos when the nations of the world got together and said, let's do peace. Shahari Chaya v'Seichel Henya Gam B'Kol HaDorosh Lefanaz. Yipnei Shemekrivim L'Hazman She'Adusei Akriza HaTorah Ksvar HaDrav. So what's going on? The Rebbe is saying, how come all of a sudden, for generation after generation, all these people thought about was war, and now all of a sudden, bing, they decide to start thinking about and talking about and meeting for peace? What's going on? What was the sudden change of mind? Ready for the zinger? You guys ready? Holding onto your chairs, your hats? So let's see what's going on. The Rebbe says the announcements and the resolution from the heads and the leaders of the world on Erev Shabbos and Parshas Mishpatim 29 years ago to meet and discuss turning their swords into plowshares. I love it. Ketzotzaa mahaklatas hachrizas malchi rabbanim hinizeh melech HaMashiach bo is a direct result from the announcement and the proclamation from the rabbis amongst the world that hinizeh melech HaMashiach bo, that Mashiach is coming right now. Basaktin shall cover kadosh v'mahal menasi dereno, including a psaktin, a halachic psak, a halachic determination of the Frierdiker Rebbe, shemekavar nishlamo masiyano v'resteno b'meshek zaman hagalus, that we've already completed all of our deeds in the times of the exile, and we are ready to greet and receive the face, the inward dimension of our righteous Mashiach. And including the psaktin from the Rabbani, and the leaders from amongst Israel, that we have reached the time of redemption, Beis David, and a king has arisen and stood up from the house of David. B'cheskas Mashiach, b'cheskas shu Mashiach, and he is presumed to be Mashiach. And then for sure he will become Mashiach Vadai, for sure Mashiach. I'll explain in a second. Psaktin Misinai, and this is Psaktin, this halachic determination not only came from the rabbis around the world, but it was declared in heaven. And therefore it came down and penetrated into this world. To the point that it turned the leaders of the nations of the world to bring together and make this announcement and make this determination that we must turn our swords into plowshares. Complete knockout. Just to fill you guys in so you can be as excited as I am, for those who are not already aware of why I'm so excited. So at this time, there was a gathering of 170 Orthodox rabbis from around the world. Many, countless of which were not Chabad. And they all signed. It's a psakin. You could Google it. Now that Google is still allowing it to come up. Who knows what will be tomorrow. That 170 Orthodox rabbis signed, according to halacha, according to the Torah, that we are at the threshold of redemption, and that the Lubavitcher Rebbe meets all the qualifications according to halacha of the Torah to be Mashiach. And that he is, in fact, B'cheskat Mashiach. And the next stage is he will become Mashiach Vadai. So just to preface, the Rambam talks about two stages of Mashiach. The first stage is called presumed Mashiach. And I don't have the Rambam in front of me to quote exactly. It's in Halachas Malachim, the final book of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, where he lays out the qualifications that if Mashiach begins the ingathering of the exiles and spreading Torah throughout the world and encouraging and fighting the wars of God, the spiritual wars of bringing forth redemption, we can presume he's Mashiach. And then if he completes his mission and builds the Beis HaMikdash in his place, then he's for sure Mashiach. So this has never happened in the history of the world, that there's been a psak din. I'm talking about 3 rabbis. I'm talking about 170 Orthodox rabbis that signed according to halacha that the Rebbe is Mashiach. No one talks about this, but it's on. Go look for yourself. It's online. You can find it. 170 signed that Mashiach, we're at the threshold of redemption, and the Rebbe has all the qualifications to be Mashiach. It's never happened since. It's never happened before, and no one has nullified that psak din. And the Rebbe said the fact that these rabbis got together and to say and to sign on such a thing, where did they come up with this idea? Just for the same reason that the nations of the world came up with the idea to meet and start discussing peace, because it came from God. That the psak din was from Sinai. That was from above. That God declared above in Shemayim, it is time for redemption and the Rebbe's Mashiach. And therefore all the rabbis down here below in the world signed that the Rebbe's Mashiach. And because of that proclamation, all the nations of the world gathered and said, now it's time. We already have Mashiach identified, and we better get moving. Judgment day is coming. We need to start getting our act together. The Rebbe is saying his mind, it's unbelievable. It's believable because I've learned this for 12 years in a row, but for those who are not familiar with these concepts, it's earth-shattering. The flat out, the Rebbe is telling us. This is the reason why this happened. Pelepois. Mamish, unbelievable. Believable, but unbelievable. And therefore, it's emphasized the relevance, the fact that they gathered together and made this announcement specifically because a psak din, a halachic declaration, came forth from Sinai that was revealed on Shabbos. Sh'az Kareem B'Torah Parshas Mishpatim, where on Shabbos we read Parshas Mishpatim. Shabo Murgashu Gam Mishpatim Heim Misinai. All there is them and don't very don't. Shakriza Menhagi Moto Ilamaal Derek Zwahara La'asim. And specifically, this is the reason why the nations of the world decided on Erev Shabbos that they need to get together and have a meeting at the UN to discuss peace. Unbelievable. So, Reb Mendel. Al pi chayav shekulam hu kahatsa psak din haTorah. They did so because they were obligated, according to the psak din of the Torah. Al derek bias Mashiach tikenu. According to the fact that it was signed as a psak din, that Mashiach is at the threshold of coming and redeeming us. Unbelievable. This needs to be publicized throughout the entire world. Zion. And furthermore, we can continue to the relevance of Parshas Mishpatim now that we're standing at the threshold and the end of the redemption and the beginning of the end of the exile and the beginning of the redemption. It's even more applicable right now. What's going on? Continuation of the Parsha. Aleph. Parshas Mishpatim bo the Achre Mechais, the Parshas Yisrael. Shesiyam v'chaisvim b'dina hamizbeach. Lama nismachoi Parshas Dinim, the Parshas Mizbeach. Remor, lecha shistishim Sanhedrin, Etzah Hamikdash, Mizbeach, Shabo Mirumaz Bekium Hayut, Hashiva Shayftaka Karishayna, Yuvas, a Sanhedrin that Shaykhis Hagizaz Habes Hamikdash Lishi, Valdrek Behem Sheka Parsha, Dora Al Makoy Ashah Nisay, Kavar Makoymi, Nicha Keneg Had Min. I'm going to keep reading inside the translator. Shaladino Beit Hamidrash Hamala Chagan Keneged Beit Hamidrash Hamata the Parshas Mishpatim Goyim the Parshas Truma Shabon Netmar Hetziva Asa Li Mikdash Shitri B'Toicham Shikai Al Asiyas HaMishkan Beit Rishayin Beit Sheni Gav Beit Shlishi Mikdash Ani Kanei Decha. The Rebbe says we see that Mishpatim is directly between Parshas Yisro and Parshas Truma, which we read next week, and we see that in Parshas Yisro we have, of course, of the giving of the Torah, and in Parshas Truma we learn all about the Mishkan, and that this is connected to redemption, where God says, "I will dwell amongst you in your individual temples, in our houses, in our homes, in our bodies." And there we see Mishpatim is directly relevant and connected to both of these. B'nei Habo Parshas Mishpatim Kedei Lahasik. And therefore we see that the emphasis in Parshas Mishpatim connected to the redemption. But Parshiyos Elu, Heim Bo'efim Mishpatim, Shemechayim Gam Mitzad Segal Adam, Chayav Shechal Nimshachal B'Chadar Be'Gidra Edom, Sho'edom Mitzad Atzmo Mechris Shigad Zman Agula. And therefore the Rebbe says that the whole emphasis of Mishpatim is the fact that not only are we fulfilling and carrying out these laws because they make logical sense, but because God gave them to us on Har Sinai. But he not only gave them to us on Har Sinai, but he did it in such a way that it should make sense in our brain, as we discussed earlier, and therefore it should make sense in our brains how important it is that Mashiach comes right now. Because if you guys are holding out for Dr. Fakakti or who's this guy, Hayden Biden, that they're going to help bring salvation to the world, well, good luck to you. Ches. V'od ve'ikar. Shugam b'parshas mishpatim asmu rumas hakashal rashachal d'sim zaman agula tchila agul albiyam bovar perush v'tershval peh. Okay, 1 second. I think I'm going to skip over here. Yeah, I'm going to skip this. This letter. He's just talking. He's going into details about if you have an ox that gores, and the different laws between man and his fellow, and the importance of respecting one another and respecting each other's and our boundaries, if you will. I'm going to hop now with Rishus of our crew over to test. I'll be Hamor La'el. 1 second. Let me just make a little notation here. שמתחזק ג'ייסר הפליאה וחתמיה ביחד עם גודל צער והרה שמצד גודל צער אין לחריך בזה ביום השבת. ככה בני ישראל מציעים עדיין בגוץ עד מסע. The Rebbe said, according to everything we said above, and to these tremendous revelations that just took place, that the Rebbe spoke about all the gatherings and the meetings from the heads of the nations of the world to bring redemption, based specifically on the fact that the Rebbe was proclaimed according to Psakdin as Melech HaMashiach. How could it be, the Rebbe says, that we find ourselves still in Golus? Ad Masai, the Rebbe says. Until when? Do you imagine this is 29 years ago? I tell you what, I stopped looking at the news. First of all, there's no news you could trust anymore. It's all just complete lies. There's no such thing as reporters anymore. Everyone is just advocates hiding behind the scene as a reporter. There's nothing to see anymore. I mean, when's the last time you turned on the news and saw anything of importance or read of anything of importance? It's nonsense. It's a poop show, for lack of a better term. It's a complete circus. So what's going on? 29 years ago, the Rebbe is screaming Ad Maseh. How much more so do we need to be screaming Ad Maseh right now? התכן של האחיקה היסמניו שבו הגאולה מתשלם התכן מהממש. Already, all the signs of the true and complete redemption have already taken place. Again, this is 29 years ago. So imagine now. It makes us really wonder, what is the holdup? The Hamora, the Erev Shabbos, Shafiro, as we're standing right now and considering the fact that on this Erev Shabbos, the nations of the world gathered together and announced and proclaimed that we must turn our swords into plowshares. We find ourselves in Shabbos Kodesh, outside the land of Israel. And instead we're here in this place, together with Jewish people from the furthest corners of the world, and including in the Holy Land, including Beit Yerushalayim HaKodesh B'Beit HaMikdash, and the Yerushalayim the Beit HaMikdash. Mosavayim l'Shulchan Aruch Uchon l'Chola l'Fnei Adam Shalav Aruchim Havayatam l'Shorabor V'Yanam l'Shmor. The Rebbe says, what are we doing here in Chutz La'aretz and outside of Israel? We need to be together with all the Jewish people gathered from the furthest corners of the world in the holy temple, in the Beis HaMikdash, feasting on the Leviathan, the Shorabor, and that tasty wine that's been aged for 5,781 years. I hear it's quite strong. What are we doing? The Rebbe says. How can it be? How are we still in the Golus? And furthermore, and mainly, that still we have not received the commandment that gives us the power that we should make ourselves a temple. Talking specifically, that it says, God says, build the temple, I will dwell amongst you. The Rebbe says, but we need the main temple, the Beis HaMikdash Shlishi. Yud. Baruch Hashem, I sped things up a little bit, so I think we're going to finish actually earlier than anticipated. Mazamuvan goido v'tzorich v'hachrach the hoisev beyoyser sha'as v'yoyser oiz b'hatir b'nenim omikravim u'muzurzim movim kafol mamash asagol v'tetechav mamash. From this we can understand the great necessity and the importance that we add on even more to all these matters that will bring forth speedily and immediately the true and complete redemption immediately, right now. Call the Rosh, first of all, as it's emphasized in Parshas Mishpatim, first of all, we must encourage and increase in our deeds of goodness and kindness between one another, and we must work on bringing peace to one another. And through this, the Rebbe says, we can bring redemption. Shebod Sion Neviot Shne'amar Sion b'mishpat tifteh v'chein v'tzarach. The Rebbe says similar with tzedakah and good deeds. This helps bring forth the redemption. Someone is poor, you must help him. And the Rebbe says, and in a way we could even say that good deeds, acts of goodness and kindness, are also a form of tzedakah, and sometimes even more than actual physical money, just by helping one another. For 70, 80 years, and a shama wears and tears just to do a favor for another. And we see even more so in the sugya, in the Masechtas Baba Basra. Prat in the mitzvah tzedakah, specifically talking about the mitzvah of tzedakah. We know that giving tzedakah helps hasten the redemption and brings forth redemption. And we know because that Hashem conducts the world in a way of kindness and righteousness. And the more we give tzedakah, the more kind and righteous we are, the more kind and righteous God is to us. I'm skipping the brackets for anyone following inside. As we continue in the Lashon of the Gemara Masechta Baba Basra. Shatoifin shiratzei. When Hagi v'chayasa sheben adam lechaverohu ba'ifrin shal beis shatoifin sheikh adam rota b'tayvaisei shal hashatoif hasheni v'alderek benonin es ha'akasa v'zias t'yesh lomar shumazad b'na beis hamikdash k'meshech hasugia v'zias avnei o mishpat the mashpia t'kasiv kal elu vanim krezben. Okay, he's giving forth this again in the Gemara, the different halachas of how we treat one another. Our things, our houses, etc. Yudov. Okay. Nitinas koach miacheres kana. And specifically, that we have a unique and special power in these days to fulfill all the directives we spoke about above. In addition to the fact that we have the unique advantage of the month of Shvat, which is the 11th month of the year. And specifically as we're entering, and now it is the 25th of the month, and Chol is referring to the blessing to the Jewish people. Brachas Kohani, referring to the blessing of the Kohani. The Varechacha es Amo Yisrael Ba'ava, that the blessing of Kohani is specifically with love, and we must bless one another with love. And that how much more so the connection and the relevance to the blessing of the Kohanim that should be blessed amongst all the Jewish people, not just the Kohanim. We all have to bless each other. In other words, it's no longer the times, oh, who am I to bless you? I actually am a Kohen, but for those who say they're not Kohanim, they say, who am I to bless? No, the Rebbe says every Jew is the power of God. We all need to bless one another. We're all here together to look out for one another. And it says every single day. It's necessary, the Rebbe says, to feel true ahavas Yisrael, true love for one another. And this is emphasized throughout the continuation of this. That it's obligated for every one of the Jewish people. And we take upon ourselves the mitzvah that we should love our fellow like ourselves. This is an obligation that we must fulfill. And namely, and furthermore, that the blessing of the Kohanim is a complete blessing. But prata brachas hachi ikris, and a main blessing. And the main blessing the Rebbe says we should be blessing each other with is the Did you know, by the way, I'm far from one of these Trekkies. I never really watched Star Trek, but Leonard Nimoy, who is Spock in Star Trek, this is the sign. So you could research it. He's a Kohen. He's a Jew. And that's where he came up with this idea to have this as his sign on Star Trek. Just a little bit of trivia for you. And the main blessing, of course, that we need to bless one another is the blessing of the true and complete redemption. And after the 25th comes the 26th of the month, which is Gematria the Shem Havayeh. Hakasharim Kiyam Mitzvahs. Kohatim B'Chezban Yisrael. Ayre HaKohanim B'Beit HaMikdash. B'Shem Meforash. And we'll be able to say God's name, the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash. V'Hachanan L'Zayre Avodas Hashem Yisrael. And the preparation for this is now through the Jewish people, who were all called in last week's Parsha. Hashem said, Amleches Kohanim, we are a kingdom of priests. That we should place God in front of us continuously. We should always be conscious and aware that everything we do, we're literally walking examples for God. How we talk to people, how we treat people, how we conduct our business. Every single thing we do, everyone's looking at us like this. We are examples of God. Gams Mahagos, even in this time of the exile. Sha'ayzem, Amirim, Amirizim, Bapualim, Gilui Shem Avai, Bakala Oilam. Kashem She'eno Nichtav Kach Anik Nikra. The Achazet, Yom Zach, Bachodesh. And after this, the Rebbe is going through the days. And after this is the 27th of the month. 27th is Gematria Zach, which means pure, to make pure. Shemen Zayas, Zach, the pure oil. The Adoidas Ner Tamid, that is used to light the continuous lights. Menorah Zahav Dehor, of the gold pure menorah. Mekashe Echas. Shemumaz Achdus Rishal Sheva Hasugim the Neshams of Israel. Meshal the Shivas Kani menorah. And just like the 7 branches of the menorah represent the 7 different emotional attributes of all the Jewish people. Each has a specific leaning to one of the attributes. We have to rectify and purify all of them, and the goal is to reach Tiferet, beauty, the center. But each one of us has a specific leaning and has different challenges and different ways to get there. And after this comes Koach, the 28th of the month. Tosefes Koach, Tochef v'choyzik b'konim elu. Koach means strength. The Rebbe says we must strengthen ourselves in all these matters. Koach, or 28, is also gematria for Yechid. Just pointing out. And after this comes Erev Rosh Chodesh. Shehu Hakana the Rosh Chodesh, which is the preparation for Rosh Chodesh. Shechidur Shalavana, and the moon is renewed. Mura'ah HaChidr the Bnei Israel, and this is also indicative of the Jewish people being renewed. Every month we get renewed, and the ultimate renewal will take place in the Gul Mitzvah Shlema, the true and complete redemption. Ubaprat Rosh Chodesh Shoyim Shayom Hashlishi V'Hofal Bo Kitay. And specifically that year, Rosh Chodesh came out on the 3rd day of the week. And we know that the 3rd day is connected to the doubling of Ki Tov. And this is the beginning of the goodness, because the main goodness will take place in the true and complete redemption. And then specifically the good will be even more doubled over. And this is connected to the good of redemption. And how much more so is this emphasized for Rosh Chodesh Adar? The Vriya Mazali, where the Mazal of the Jew is strong. Good time to bring some court cases if you have them. The Simcha, where all undesirable matters will be turned over and transformed to joy. Hasimcha Gula HaPurim, and this joy of the redemption of Purim. Yismech Gula Geula, and brings forth from redemption to redemption, from the redemption of Purim to the redemption of Pesach. And just like when I took you out of Egypt, I will once again show you wonders. Ad Masai. Mismah Gan Bishinoy Hased. And this will bring about the joy of bringing forth the true and complete redemption that will be complete even before we reach the goal of Purim. Yud base. And as we are reaching and culminating from the joy of redemption to redemption, referring to the second Adar, coming close to Nisan. That year was a double. Also, we see the connecting to closeness of Adar to Shvat. Melashon HaMishnah. Ein mein Adar Rishon la'Adar Sheni ela Kriyasa Megillah Umina Metanos Levioni. And according to the Mishnah, good 7th of Adar, it's a good day. The birth of Moshe Rabbeinu, and Adar as it is. So as the Mishnah says, the only difference in the first, in that year there was double Adars, and it's the only difference in the first Adar and the second Adar is that there's no reading of the Megillah and giving of gifts to the poor on the first Adar. Mashma sheba ashar inini. This implies that there's just as reason to be joyful in Adar Rishon. And Rishon also referring to its advantage and its importance. And this is emphasized as it's connected to the 7th of Adar. Oh. Shekashor im bittul gezeras Haman, which is connected to the nullification of the gezerah, the decree of evil Haman. Ooh. Nafal poor b'chodesh Adar, where the lottery fell out, the goral, on the month of Adar. The Sheves Adar no live Moshe, and of course Haman, the Putz, thought that it was a bad month because Moshe passed on the 7th of Adar, but he forgot to realize that he was also born on the 7th of Adar. Sheikar inim ba'adar harishayim. The other example is Tziyenu b'kama inim sha'adar stam. Kai al Adar Rishayim. In addition to this, that we find in Shabbos Mavarchim, that it's announced at the time of the Torah, Rosh Chodesh Adar Rishayim, B'Yom HaShlishi, that the month of Rosh Chodesh Adar will be on the 3rd, the Rosh Chodesh will be on the 3rd of the month. That already Mashiach, our righteous Redeemer, will come before them, before Rosh Chodesh. We'll already be entering into the Holy of Holies. The Sanhedrin will return. And this will take place even before Adar and even before Nisan. Yud Gimel. Well, look at this. Baruch Hashem. We had a long Sikha, and we tackled it expeditiously. And we're going to finish early. Baruch Hashem. But it's a very powerful thing to resonate in our noodles and bake around a little bit. Yud Gimel, and we have a nice little strong pigaz bomb at the end of the Sikha to end off with. Yud Gimel, Hirat Sain, maybe Hashem's will. Mainly, that the true and complete redemption through a righteous Redeemer should take place immediately, mamish, the Rebbe says. Uvadai, and for sure, this will definitely take place before we reach the month of Nisan. And even before we reach Nisan, and even before we reach Adar. Because Mashiach, our righteous Redeemer, is going to come in this Shabbos Mavarchim of Chodesh Adar, the first Adar, that is close and connected to the month of Shvat, Zach Shvat, the 27th of Shvat, and specifically this Shabbos after Chatzos, Bizman Mincha V'Sura Shlishi, in the time of Mincha and the third meal, Shekashor Im Gula Hashlishi of Beit HaMikdash Shlishi, which is connected to the third Beis HaMikdash. Befall mamish, and it should really take place in actuality right now through all of our deeds. Mamish, immediately. This is another very powerful saying of the Rebbe to remove any other doubts if anyone still has them. And the Rebbe says, according to all the explanations of miyad, the Rebbe uses the term miyad many times in the Sichos. Miyad is immediately, and it's also a Rosh Tevis, an acronym for Mem Yud Daled. And what is Mem Yud Daled? The Rebbe says now, Klal, Gama Rosh Tevis Klalois, Hadurais. It's also including this Rosh Tevis. Again, miyad means immediately, and the letters for miyad are Mem Yud Daled. Now, the Rebbe is going to explain there's several interpretations of what that acronym stands for. The Rosh Tevis in Hebrew. It is referring to the generations of Moshe, that's Mem, Yisrael, the Baal Shem Tov, which is Yud, and David Malcha Mashiach, and King Mashiach, which is David, right? Moshe, Yisrael, David. V'chal HaPerushim Shemamash, and all the explanation of what mamish means. Mamish also means like emphasis. So miyad is immediately, and mamish is like really immediately, like emphasizing immediately. The call the rosh, and first of all, what is mamash? Miyad mamish, pshuto, in the simplest sense. Mamish, mamish, mamish. 3 times the Rebbe says mamish. And now he brings down in the footnote further explanation. Footnote 148, if you're following along. And this is more specific in our generation. Shorasha Tevis Miyad, that the acronym for the word Miyad, Mem Yud Dalet, the Rumzim Gam Atukufos Ashaychos the Kavod Kadoshi Mari Admor Nasi Derenu, is referring to the 3 distinct periods that are relevant to the leadership of the leader of the generation. Va'al Seder Hakriva Elenu, and they're all according to our terms. What are they? The Mem. You ready? You're holding on to your hats and your horses. Again, Miyad. Mem Yud Dalet. The Mem the Rebbe stands for is Mashiach, Menachem Shmo, and his name is Menachem. The Yud is for Yosef Yitzchak, the previous Rebbe, and the Dalet is for Dober, the Rebbe before that. If there's any doubts in anyone's mind that the Rebbe is not already telling us it's Mashiach and the Sicha, he ends it by specifically telling you, Miyad stands for, the Mem is for Mashiach, and his name is Menachem. The Yud is for Yosef Yitzchak, and the Dalet is for Dober, the final 3 Rebbes, 5th, 6th, and 7th. And of course, Mamish also stands for Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Yechia Adonenu Morenu v'Rabbeinu Melech HaMashiach Memboed. We should have the full Hizgadlus of the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach. God should take us out of this mess in a way of rachamim, and we should be, before these words come out of my mouth, in the Beis HaMikdash Shlishi, for bringing and joy and simcha and really having a true redemption. Hashem should bless each and every one of us across the world to have true personal redemption from any difficulties, any challenges, real, imaginary, financial, health, any way whatsoever. And most importantly, we should have the full and final redemption now. God bless you. Mashiach now. See you next week in the Beis HaMikdash.